The vineyard shimmered in late afternoon light, rows of grapes stretching toward the horizon, the air thick with the scent of roses and polished wood. I smoothed the front of my dress, steadying my breath as I stepped into the registration line. Everyone around me buzzed with excitement, their voices rising like champagne bubbles. The woman at the table barely glanced at me before reaching into a cardboard box. She pulled out a small square of paper with a bent corner, printed in stark black letters. Limited guest. No gold edging, no ribbon, no elegant calligraphy. Just cheap laminate and a strip of tape, the kind used for factory tours. I stared at it for a moment, waiting for her to realize the mistake, but she only set it down on the table, already turning to the next guest. The woman behind me leaned forward, beaming as she received her gold-trimmed lanyard, her name written in sweeping script. She slipped it on like a jewel. I picked up the badge. Its edges curled slightly in the heat, for a heartbeat. I considered asking why. Then I felt a hand clap my shoulder, heavy and mocking. Cassian stood there, his suit a little too tight across the middle, his grin wide. "Guess they finally figured you out," he said, voice loud enough for the couple beside us to hear. They smirked, not at him, but at me. My cheeks burned. I wanted to answer, but no words came. Instead, I pinned the flimsy square to my dress, feeling its weight like a brand. As Cassian walked away, still chuckling, I forced myself forward into the hall where the music swelled, and the celebration waited without me. The music from the hall rose in bursts of laughter and clinking glasses as I stepped to the side, pressing my back against the wall. I touched the badge again, the paper softening beneath my fingers, and then my hand slid into my purse. My fingertips brushed the smooth envelope that had sat there for weeks, sealed and ready. Inside was the check $100,000. I had written it slowly, my pen digging into the paper, as if each digit carried the weight of the hours behind it. Every overnight shift, every holiday I'd spent in the hospital instead of at home, every postponed vacation and pair of worn-out shoes had led to this gift. It wasn't just money. It was years of my life, distilled into numbers on a page. When I first tucked it into the envelope, I imagined handing it to Isolde with pride, her eyes shining as she realized how much I had believed in her future. I thought it might be a bridge, a way back to the closeness we once had. But standing there now, the badge pressing into my skin like a scarlet letter, the envelope felt less like love and more like ransom. I closed my eyes and saw the nights I'd stumbled home after 18 hours on my feet, peeling off scrubs that smelled of antiseptic. I heard the echo of my own voice promising myself that the sacrifices would be worth it that one day. When my sister walked into her future, I'd be standing right beside her. But worth it to whom? To Isolde, who hadn't looked for me when I entered, to Cassian, whose laughter still rang in my ears. The envelope grew heavier in my purse, as though it knew the answer. I pushed it deeper into the bag, clutching the strap tighter as I took a breath and stepped farther into the reception, determined to see where this night was truly headed. The sight of the envelope pressed me back into memory, pulling me to a morning that had split our lives in two. I was 19 when the phone call came, the one that told us our father's truck had been struck head-on by a driver who hadn't stopped drinking after last call. Overnight, the air in our small house thickened with silence, and suddenly everything was mine to hold. I remember standing in the kitchen, Isolde curled on a chair with her knees to her chest, Cassian pacing with fists clenched, demanding answers no one could give. I said I would take the night shifts at the diner until I found something steadier. I promised Isolde she wouldn't have to leave her school, that her world could stay intact, even if mine couldn't. It started small. I gave her my bedroom, telling her she needed space to study, while I folded out a cot in the corner of the living room. When she wanted braces, I signed up for overtime at the hospital, shoes splitting at the seams as I pushed carts of supplies. Every holiday became just another shift to fill. By the time she was applying to college, I had built a second job into my weekends, enough to cover what scholarships didn't. Cassian never forgave me for stepping in as caretaker. He sneered at the extra hours I worked, called me a martyr whenever the bills were paid on time. You like being the hero. He'd spit, as if sacrifice were a crown I'd chosen instead of a weight I couldn't drop. But he never offered to carry it. I told myself it didn't matter. What mattered was that Isolde had everything she needed. I convinced myself my life could wait, that I'd pick it back up once hers was secure. Now, in the middle of a celebration where I barely belonged, I wondered if I had been building a foundation for her or digging a hollow underneath myself that I could never crawl out of. I first met Verity Aldwin months before the wedding, in a cafe that smelled faintly of citrus and linen. I had suggested the small diner near my apartment, a place where I knew the waitress by name, and the coffee was always hot. Isolde insisted on something more fitting for the occasion. When I walked in, Verity was already seated, her posture elegant, her handbag perched on the chair beside her like a companion. She greeted me with a smile that didn't touch her eyes, the kind of smile that said she'd already measured me and found me wanting. After the waiter set down our drinks, she leaned in, her voice smooth as silk. It's remarkable, the way you've helped cover the deposit for the banquet hall. So generous, especially on a nurse's salary. The words were wrapped in sweetness, but the sting was sharp. I laughed softly, the practiced kind of laugh that smooths the edges of humiliation. I had heard worse, I told myself, yet the way Isolde's lips tightened, then relaxed into a faint smile, unsettled me. She didn't defend me. She didn't even change the subject. She simply watched Verity with a look I hadn't seen before, admiration, almost hunger. As the months wore on, I noticed the changes. Isolde's voice took on the same careful cadence Verity used, clipped and deliberate. She began gesturing with small, precise movements, as if every flick of her hand were rehearsed. In phone calls, she was brisk, efficient, as though warmth was something she no longer had time to spare. I told myself it was stress. Weddings stretched people thin. But every time Verity was in the room, Isolde seemed to stand taller, her spine straighter, her laugh quieter, as though she were auditioning for a part. And in those moments, I felt myself fading, not just from the center of her life, but from the edges too. Still, I kept paying invoices, kept saying yes when asked to transfer money, kept telling myself love required patience. I ignored the unease, because to acknowledge it meant facing a truth I wasn't ready to hold. That truth pressed harder now as the music swelled in the reception hall and I stood on the sidelines, clutching a badge that told me exactly where I belonged. The weeks leading up to the wedding had been filled with small reminders of where I stood, though at the time I told myself they were harmless oversights. When the schedule for the rehearsal dinner arrived, my name was missing from the list of speakers. I asked Isolde if she wanted me to prepare a toast, something simple, a few words about family. She hesitated just long enough for me to understand the answer before she said, "We thought we'd keep it short. Too many voices get messy." Her tone was polished, rehearsed, almost identical to Verity's. At the ceremony itself, I sat in the third row, tucked neatly behind distant cousins and family friends. I reminded myself it didn't matter, that what counted was seeing Isolde radiant in her gown. Still, as I watched the bridal party from my distant seat, I couldn't shake the sense that I was witnessing rather than belonging. Even our conversations had shifted. They used to be filled with small confidences, her favorite books, her doubts about her career path, the silly inside jokes that only siblings could understand. But in the months before the wedding, our calls had narrowed into lists, deposits due, deadlines looming, which florist had confirmed, which hadn't. Her voice was clipped, her gratitude more obligation than affection. Each time I hung up, I told myself it was the stress of planning, that the warmth would return once the vows were spoken and the details faded into memory. I convinced myself she would look for me in the crowd, call me to her side, Acknowledge me not just as the sister who helped keep the gears turning, but as family who mattered. That belief was the thread I held on to, even as it frayed with every exchange. It was the only reason I kept answering her calls, kept wiring money when there was a gap, kept telling myself love was patient, that it endured small exclusions. Now, standing in the corner of the reception hall with the badge pressed flat against my chest, I realized the pattern had only reached its inevitable conclusion. The thread had unraveled, and I was no longer holding anything at all. The reception hall glowed with strings of fairy lights looped across beams and wrapped around pillars. Guests flowed into the room in clusters, their badges glinting under the soft light. I drifted toward the seating chart mounted on a gilded easel, scanning the neat rows of names. Table after table. Family grouped with family. Friends with friends. The groom's relatives filling the first two lines. My eyes traveled down to the end, then back again. Slower this time. My name wasn't there. I stood still, waiting for the letters to materialize, for some oversight to write itself. But the truth stared back at me, steady and undeniable. I had no place at any table. A waiter brushed past with a tray of champagne flutes, the bubbles catching in the glow. He didn't offer one to me. Another passed with salmon on porcelain plates. Again, not a glance in my direction. It was as though the badge pinned to my dress had turned me invisible. I moved toward the far edge of the room, finding cover behind a column wrapped in white fabric and lights. From there, I had a clear view of the head table. Isolde sat radiant, her lace gown catching every spark of light. She leaned toward her new husband, her smile wide and unguarded, while cameras flashed around them. People raised glasses, laughter spilling into the air like a song. Across the room, Cassian caught my eye. He was already watching me, his glass lifted in a mock salute. His grin spread slowly, satisfied, as though my absence from the chart was a private joke made public. I dropped my gaze, unwilling to give him the victory of seeing my face crack. The badge pressed into my skin. Cheap paper against fabric, a mark of my place or my lack of it. I stayed behind the column, listening to the rhythm of applause and laughter wash over me without touching me, a tide I was never meant to enter. And then, almost without deciding, I turned toward the corner where the gift table sat, the envelope in my purse suddenly heavy, calling me forward. The gift table stood in the corner near the entrance, draped in white linen and crowded with glossy bags tied with satin bows. Cards sat stacked in gilded boxes, some with embossed seals, others with careful calligraphy. I scanned the display until I saw mine plain white. No ribbon, my handwriting sharp and unmistakable. No one had touched it. I stood over it for a moment, my fingers hovering just above the envelope. My chest tightened as I thought of the nights I had carried double shifts, the mornings I dragged myself home with aching legs, whispering promises that it would all be worth it. I thought of the vacations I never took, the small comforts I denied myself so the number inside could grow. $100,000. A lifetime of sacrifice folded neatly into paper. My hand closed around it before I could second-guess myself. The paper was cool against my palm, a fragile thing to hold the weight of so many years. I slipped it back into my purse, the zipper's teeth closing over it like a gate. A hush rippled behind me, faint but unmistakable. I could feel eyes on my back, the shift in the air as people turned toward the table and registered what I had done. A murmur passed like wind through leaves, soft at first, then sharper as it spread. Still, no one spoke to me directly. I straightened, lifting the strap of my purse higher on my shoulder. My steps toward the door were steady, though my heart thudded hard against my ribs. The music carried on behind me, clinking glasses and bursts of laughter swelling as if to drown out the sound of my retreat. And then, above it all, a voice cut through the noise, sharp, urgent, familiar. My name, called once, then again, louder. The gravel crunched under my heels as I moved down the path toward the parking lot, the cool night air settling around me like a cloak. Behind me, the music grew faint, muffled by distance, but the sound of my name carried above it Isolde's voice, sharp with panic. I kept my pace steady, the envelope secure in my purse, my fingers gripping the strap as though it tethered me to my decision. Another call rang out, closer this time, and I heard the unmistakable scrape of fabric against stone. I glanced back just long enough to see her, gown lifted in both hands, train dragging, her face pale in the glow of the vineyard lights. For an instant, the sight of her pulled at me, the same way it always had. I remembered the little girl clutching my sleeve at school pickups, the teenager sobbing into my lap after her first heartbreak. She looked the same now, desperate, reaching, afraid. But I turned away before the image could root itself deeper. My steps quickened, the weight of years pressing forward rather than back. The parking lot came into view, a line of cars glinting under dim lamps. My keys rattled as I pulled them free, my hand trembling only slightly as I fit the metal into the lock. "Please," she shouted, her voice breaking on the word. I paused, just for a breath, the sound cutting through me like glass. Then I opened the door, slid inside, and pulled it shut. The world outside muffled instantly, her voice reduced to a faint echo. The engine turned over, steady and sure, the hum vibrating beneath me as I shifted into reverse. Through the rearview mirror, I caught one last glimpse of her, a figure in white, standing alone at the edge of the lot, hands hanging uselessly at her sides. I looked forward again, pressed my foot to the gas, and followed the winding road out of the vineyard, the lights and music receding until there was nothing but darkness ahead and the silence of my own breath. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sky had shifted to that washed-out blue that follows a storm, though no rain had fallen. I sat in the car for a long while, the envelope resting on the seat beside me like a silent witness. My phone buzzed again and again, screen flashing with names I didn't have the strength to face. I powered it off, carried the silence inside with me, and let it settle in the rooms like a new kind of furniture. That night, I brewed tea I didn't drink and sat at the kitchen table staring at the pale square of light spilling from the lamp. The quiet was heavy, but it was mine. I went to bed without answering a single message. The next afternoon, my phone lit up with a call from Maren, a friend of mine who sometimes worked weddings as a planner's assistant. Her voice was cautious, almost apologetic. "I thought you should know," she said, and the words unraveled everything I had tried to hold together. She told me I had been listed at the head table, right beside Isolde, in the original seating chart. Weeks ago, it was marked clearly in green ink. Then, just 4 days before the wedding, Verity requested changes. My name was shifted down the list to what she called overflow. The final draft bore Isolde's checkmark, her quiet consent. I thanked Maren and hung up, my hands trembling. The betrayal landed colder than rage, heavier than grief. It wasn't just Verity's doing. Isolde had seen, had agreed, had let it happen. I sat in the stillness, the envelope unopened beside me, knowing the silence between us had grown into something that could no longer be crossed. On the 4th day, the phone rang again. I almost let it go to voicemail, but the name on the screen held me still. Isolde's voice came through heavy, frayed at the edges. "We can't book the honeymoon without your check. The deposit is due tomorrow." I listened, letting the silence breathe. She filled it quickly, her words tumbling over each other. "I didn't mean for things to happen this way. Verity said the seating was tight, and I thought it didn't matter where you sat. Please, I need you to help us." My throat tightened, but my voice came out calm, steadier than I felt. "If I ever give again, it won't be a gift. It will be on my terms, signed, clear, with conditions. Not one-sided anymore." There was only a soft intake of breath on the other end, then a faint sob. I let it sit there between us for a moment before I pressed the phone to end the call. The quiet that followed was not empty. It was mine. That evening, I slipped on gloves and carried a small box of bulbs into the garden. Near the fence, the soil was loose from the last rain. I knelt and pressed deep purple tulip bulbs into the earth, the same kind Isolde once called princess flowers when she was little. Only this time, I planted them for myself, for the part of me that had waited too long to be seen. The dirt clung to my fingers, cool and grounding. As I patted the soil back into place, the garden held me steady, the silence finally soft, no longer a wound, but a promise.